So is the anthems going to be is it recorded?
Yes, ma'am. We're ready with the anthems, with both the essay
Okay,
and
so
the new anthems.
okay, is our speakers on the platform?
We have the Deputy Minister, and we also have Honorable Dango who will be speaking.
Okay.
Professor Gumere will be joining us a little bit later.
Thank you. Then I think we should start. Good afternoon to everyone. I hope I am visible as I am audible, because we are still having a problem of making sure that I can turn my visual around, but we are still working on that. So
You are
before
both, Deputy Chair, you are both visible and audible.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chief Whip. I appreciate it. Good afternoon to everyone. Before we start, let us really just start our program in the way that we usually do it, by observing a moment of silent prayer or meditation. Thank you very much. We have been testing. We are connecting. So we will then now request that the national anthem and the AU anthem be rendered for us.
To fight together for Let us all unite and join together to give the best we have to Africa, the cradle of mankind and fount of culture, our pride and hope and break of dawn. Oh, sons and daughters of Africa, flesh of the sun and flesh of the sky, let us make Africa the tree of life.
Thank you very much for the anthems. I think for a change, we didn't have any technical issues with regards to our anthems, and we appreciate that. I am requested, and I have already greeted everyone. I am requested to do the welcoming address to this auspicious occasion on the celebration of the day of our continent proper. Now, let me just do the acknowledgements by acknowledging our chairperson in absentia, speakers of provincial legislatures, deputy speaker of the National Assembly, members of provincial excos, district mayors, councillors, members of parliament, of provincial legislatures, our esteemed panelists and guests, ladies and gentlemen. As we commemorate Africa Day, may we remember the words of our iconic leader, Kwame Nkrumah, when he said, and I quote, "We must unite or perish." We know that this day actually is it's found in 1963 with the founding of the African Organization of African Unity, where leaders of the independent states in Africa get together in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to sign the founding charter of the Organization of African Unity. And that very same organization established its successor, the African Union, which was a resounding milestone in our history, signaling the beginning of Africa's renewal and development. November 2020 marked 31 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, as well as the 136th anniversary of the start of the Conference of Berlin. Both moments in history were significant events for Africa, as many believe that Africa suffers from a curse invoked in Berlin, which drastically altered Africa's development trajectory. That conference, which was overseen by Otto von Bismarck, dealt with issues of free trade in the Congo and the Niger, as well as the status of protectorates, effectively setting the rules for the partitions of Africa as the scramble for the continent's reaches began. The European curse of artificial nation states has thus caused untold suffering in post-colonial Africa, resulting in unviable and dependent economies, artificially important political systems, weak and balkanized states, and insecure borders. Honorable members, many years have passed, and African leaders have not yet done enough to reverse this blighted legacy. However, through the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement founded in 2018, with trade commencing as from 1st of January 2021, we believe that the African continent is finally on a growth trajectory, unified under a common purpose to collectively reverse the legacy of the scramble for Africa's wealth. The African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement should rightfully be recognized as the largest free trade agreement since the signing of the World Trade Organization in 1994. This cutting-edge agreement seeks to create a single market of goods, services, and I really don't want to say too much, taking away from what our speakers or our presenters will be saying. But if effectively implemented, it will promote and advance the attainment of sustainable and inclusive socio-economic development across the continent. It will also serve as a conduit for advancing gender equality and enable the structural transformation of state parties. During the current economic climate, particularly as a result of the COVID-19 economic aftershocks, it is imperative that the appropriate oversight and accountability systems be put in place so as to measurably improve women's quality of life, including all vulnerable groups on the continent. We must remain cognizant that there is a high risk that some of the economic gains made by women through trade initiatives could be reversed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. According to the Economic Commission for Africa, women account for around 70% of informal cross-border traders in Africa. Through the informal cross-border trading processes, women can be vulnerable to harassment, violence, and confiscation of goods. Tariff reduction under the agreement will enable informal women traders to operate through formal channels and bring about better protection for women. Furthermore, a growing industrial and manufacturing sector in South Africa is particularly imperative, so is to provide new job opportunities, particularly for women and youth. According to the Secretary General of the Free Trade Agreement, Mr. Wamkele Mene, the pact will be the opportunity to close the gender income gap and the opportunity for SMEs to access new markets. This should be counted as an important aspiration, since small and medium-sized enterprises account for 90% of jobs in Africa. It will promote industrial development through diversification and regional value chain development. It will further lay the foundation for the establishment of a continental customs union at a later stage. This pact emerged at a critical time, particularly as the global community descended into the unprecedented pandemic in 2020, which has rapidly reshaped countries, societies, and communities. The response to the pandemic has changed political and social systems and created new social norms. The world continues to face a plethora of challenges, including and not limited to climate change, inequality, technological change, migration and displacement, which is complex, evolving, and demands collective action. Our response as a country and a continent must be both targeted and emphatic so as to capitalize on opportunities available. Honorable members, distinguished guests, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it. I believe that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is an instrument that we have been looking to discover. In this agreement, there is the mission of this generation and this continent, and we stand ready to bring it to fruition. Let me conclude this welcoming remarks with an excerpt from His Excellency President Nkrumah's speech, which he delivered in 1963. And I quote, "No sporadic act, no pious resolution can resolve our present problems. Nothing will be of avail except the united act of a united Africa." My responsibility is simply to welcome all of you to the Africa Day lecture in celebration of what we call Africa Day, and where we as Africans can reconnect to our continent and to the people of Africa. And I want to welcome all of you, and I also particularly want to welcome our esteemed guest speakers in the person of our Deputy Minister, Minister Fikile Majola, as well as Professor Gumede, as well as our Honorable Member of the NCOP, Honorable Dangor, as well as our Honorable Chief Whip, who is always so supportive in our programs to commemorate ourselves and our history. With that said, I want to welcome all of you, and we will continue with our program. And in continuing with our program, we will now call on, let me just continue to make sure that I'm calling the correct person, because we are calling on our Deputy Minister to do the keynote address. But before that, I just want to make sure whether there is any other item in the program, because if there is none, we will continue with our program as we have started it. And then we will then call on the Deputy Minister to render the keynote for us. I've been looking forward. I'm so nervous because I've been looking forward to this program so much. I am very nervous. So with that said, we will now call on our Deputy Minister, Comrade Fikile Majola, Deputy Minister of Trade, Industry and Development. And we know that he is coming with a wealth of information with regards to the specific topic that is on our agenda today. Over to you, Honorable Deputy Minister.
Good afternoon, Deputy Chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable Lucas. In absentia, the Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable Senoli, the Honorable Chief Whip, honorable members, Professor Gumedo, fellow Africans, good afternoon. Today, I'm humbled to address this august house on such a very special occasion where all of us Africans join together to celebrate Africa Day. This day gives us an opportunity to reflect on the shared commitments and pledges towards the renewal of the African continent for the benefit of all her peoples. The theme of today's event instructs us to move with speed towards building a strong foundation for Africa's inclusive economic growth, and the African Continental Free Trade Area provides us with the platform to advance this core objective. On this august occasion, I would like to recollect the words of Jomo Kenyatta, the late former President of the Republic of Kenya, who said, and I quote, "Our children may learn about heroes of the past. Our task is to make ourselves the architects of the future," close quote. These words carry a significant meaning for this generation as we continue to navigate our way through the unprecedented times to make ourselves the architects of the future. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to damage economies, escalating poverty and inequality across the globe and our continent. The number of daily COVID-19 cases have started to increase in the African region, particularly in South Africa, the top most reporting country, where cases and deaths have again increased compared to the previous weeks. Other countries reporting a recent increase in cases include Algeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Mauritania, Namibia, Uganda, and Zambia. In South Africa to date, close to 60,000 people have unfortunately lost their lives to COVID-19. South Africa has more than 1.6 million positive cases identified. While we continue to fight against COVID-19, we also have a huge responsibility to continue the daunting task of building regional integration in line with the vision of our liberators from past generations, which inspired the founding of the Organization of African Unity on May 25, 1963. Honorable members, today, as we reflect on the huge and daunting task currently facing our continent of creating the African Continental Free Trade Area, it is worth repeating the words of one of the greatest and true sons of our beloved continent, Kwame Nkrumah, that I recited recently at the DTIC budget vote, and I quote, "It is clear we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can only be found in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world," close quote. On the African Continental Free Trade Area as a catalyst, the 13th Extraordinary Summit of the AFCFTA held on the 5th December 2020 provided the legal basis for the operationalization of preferential trade from 1 January 2021. This has been a significant step towards the realization of a socio-economic integrated continent as envisaged by the founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity 57 years ago this month. The AFCFTA will create the largest free trade area in the world by a number of countries participating and connect 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined GDP valued at $3.4 trillion. However, to make this a reality, significant policy reforms and trade facilitation measures are necessary. The start of trade under the AFCFTA is indeed a major achievement for the continent. It is a catalyst for boosting intra-Africa trade and investment, industrialization, as well as inclusive economic growth and development. The AFCFTA is one of the flagship projects of the African Union's Agenda 2063, aims to build an integrated market in Africa, anchored on a development integration approach where market integration is accompanied by cooperation to overcome infrastructure backlogs and policy cooperation to promote economic diversification, including industrial development and building of cross-border regional value chains. The AFCFTA was launched in Kigali, Rwanda in March 2018 as a milestone that marked Africa's commitment to the creation of an integrated and diversified market in Africa of approximately 1.3 billion people. While original ideas for the African integration go back decades to the immediate post-colonial era in the late 1950s and 1960s, the African Union's first conceptualized the idea of an African continental free trade area in January 2012 at its 18th session in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Our leaders recognize that the promotion of intra-African trade is a fundamental factor for sustainable economic development, employment generation, and effective integration of Africa into the global economy, therefore a call for an AFCFTA. This flagship economic initiative seeks to address the challenges of Africa's share of low levels of participation in the global economy and world trade, which stands at 3% despite the fact that Africa accounts for approximately 16% of the world's population. The continental free trade area should also grow intra-Africa trade, which is very small and stands at approximately 16 to 18%, which is comparatively low to other regions. Namely, intra-Asian trade is at 52%, intra-North American trade at 50%, and intra-European Union trade at 70%. However, for most African countries, inter-African trade is already considerably more important than the aggregate figures suggest. Indeed, the shares of intra-African trade in African countries' total exports shows that Africa is by far the second most important export market for most African countries behind Europe. 7 African countries count Africa as their main export market, and 25 count it as their second most important market. More importantly, inter-African trade is largely in value-added manufactured products, and over 3/4 of intra-African trade takes place within regional trading blocs. The AFCFTA provides an opportunity to grow trade between African economic regional blocs to diversify and grow value-added manufacturing and jobs. The free trade area sets out a framework for tariff liberalization across Africa and aims to establish a more open trade environment rules-based that can help to create conditions to boost intra-Africa trade. It establishes due process in resolution of trade disputes. In terms of the market integration process, tariff reduction amongst African economies alongside effective rules of origin should encourage new investment to take advantage of the growing African market. The negotiations are premised on a number of principles. Importantly, we have agreed on reciprocity so that the tariff reductions are equivalent across countries, but we also allow differentiation to take into account different levels of economic development across the continent. This takes into account differences between developing and least developed economies in Africa to ensure that the continental free trade area benefits all African economies. It is important to underscore that the initiative preserves current regional arrangements as building blocks to create a large, more integrated market. The AfCFTA does not replace SADC, for example. In effect, South Africa and SACU is negotiating new trade arrangements outside SADC with ECOWAS, East African Community, CIMEC, and North African countries. To date, 54 out of the 55 African Union members have signed the AfCFTA. This demonstrates the high level of commitment and political will by African leaders to African economic integration, and the AfCFTA in particular. The following legal architecture has been broadly agreed to and constitute the AfCFTA. Agreement establishing the AfCFTA, firstly, is the main agreement. Secondly, protocols on trade in services. Thirdly, protocol on rules and procedures for settlement of disputes. Phase 2 negotiations will cover competition, intellectual property, investment, and e-commerce. As the chairperson alluded to, the agreement established a secretariat for the AfCFTA that is currently headquartered in Ghana, headed by a South African, Mr. Wamkelemen. The COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on the finalization of the outstanding negotiations. Negotiations restarted in September 2020 with South Africa chairing the meetings. There was an intensive process leading to the 5th December 2020 summit. The decisions of the summit of 5 December 2020 took into account the AU members are at different stages of readiness to operationalize preferential trade. Not all had ratified at the time or submitted tariff offers, and not all rules of origins were agreed. However, ratifications were continuing and rules of origin negotiations are proceeding. We managed to get agreement on the rules of origin for 81% of all tariff lines at the time. We have since been able to increase the agreed rules of origin to 86% with some chapters, namely automotive, sugar, clothing and textiles, and edible oils still under negotiation. Rules of origin determine how much of the value of the goods traded under preferences must be made in Africa. This is critical to encourage a move up the value chain and ensuring that the benefits of the integration process accrue to African producers. In summary, the 5th December 2020 summit provided the legal framework to allow the AU members and customs unions to agree to operationalize preferential trade amongst them in a somewhat flexible manner. The decision specified that members could enter into agreement as soon as the following minimum conditions are agreed. Ratification of the AfCFTA by individual members and by all members of customs unions that want to participate in the exchange of preferences. The submission of technically sound tariff offers based on the 81% of tariff lines with agreed rules of origin, domestic legislation to administer imports, and agreement by both sides that reciprocity had been achieved. The process of assessing and verifying tariff offers is currently underway. In SACU, Botswana is yet to ratify the agreement, but it has indicated that other SACU members can move ahead while it completes its internal processes, in particular, ongoing negotiations on rules of origin and working towards increasing the tariff offers to 90%. All this work is currently ongoing. Trade agreements produce gains and losses, honorable members, in production, in trade, and in employment. Import competing sectors can face increased competitive pressures that can result in job losses and loss of industrial capacity. How gains and losses are managed across all participating members are key to the sustainability of the agreement and its implementation. There is also concern about the risk of transshipment, whereby products from countries outside Africa gain preferential access to African markets under the guise of the AfCFTA. This requires that we build up capacity to monitor and enforce rules of origin at ports of entry. The AfCFTA brings us a step closer to realizing the historic vision of an integrated market in Africa and creating a basis for increasing intra-African trade. We must complement and consolidate parallel AU work on infrastructure and industrial development pillars, build supply capacity to take advantage of more open African markets. President Cyril Ramaphosa, in his address to the joint sitting of Parliament on South Africa's economic reconstruction and recovery plan, stated that this plan directly responds to the immediate economic impact of COVID-19. Our country and other countries across the African continent and the rest of the world are engaged in a monumental battle to restore the economy in the midst of an ongoing onslaught from an invisible enemy that has destroyed lives and livelihoods, the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the instructive lessons learned from this crisis is that economic resilience is critical. Given that many of the African countries do not have the means to cushion themselves against the resultant economic devastation, it is critical to build up industrial capabilities, trade and supply chains across the African countries. It is imperative for us to look beyond our borders to accomplish the task of inclusive economic growth and job creation. In this regard, we have to seize the opportunity presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area as South Africans. Our country accounts for approximately a quarter of all intertrade in the continent and will benefit massively from driving the consolidation of Africa's integrated market. The creation of capacity to produce PPEs in the light of the fight against COVID-19 has also given us the opportunity to become a supplier to the SACU communities and broader African continent. The imperative of Africa's economic integration agenda is more urgent than ever as we contend with the impact of the global economic downturn and growing uncertainty exacerbated by the aftermath of the pandemic. Africa's vulnerabilities and limited participation in global trade is a function of its traditional over-dependence on the export of low-value raw materials and commodities, and the import of higher value-added manufactured goods and services. The continent's full potential will remain unfulfilled unless we address the challenges of poor infrastructure, small and fragmented markets, underdeveloped production structures, and inadequate economic diversification. It is also important to note that over 3/4 of inter-African trade takes place within regional trading blocs, demonstrating that our regional integration programs are the most important avenues for deepening inter-African trade. The AfCFTA seeks to build on this and not seek to replace the integration already achieved in the established regional economic communities of the African Union. This is well captured in the agreed AfCFTA principles that all of the preservations of existing trading arrangements, such as SADC, the importance of African trade in South Africa's overall trade continues to grow. In 2019, 27% of South Africa's world exports and 12% of world imports were intra-Africa. South Africa continues to record a large trade surplus with the rest of the continent, exporting mainly mineral products, machinery, chemicals, iron and steel products, which account for over 50% of its total exports to the rest of the continent. South Africa exports to the African continent, South Africa's exports to the African countries account for approximately 26.5%, which are primarily value-added goods, including iron, steel, motor vehicles, basic chemicals, and refined petroleum products. 11% of all South Africa's imports is from Africa and comprised of nuts and seeds, agricultural goods, animal products, oil, and fuel products. Access to the markets of the rest of the African continent is important because those are relatively fast-growing economies. Exports of value-added goods to these markets create employment in the South African economy. An integrated market must also work to foster the development of regional value chains and ensure that the costs and benefits are equitably shared amongst all African economies. In this regard, the AfCFTA's rules of origin are a vital industrial policy tool and aim to ensure that African economies enjoy the benefits of the larger market. The AfCFTA will encourage industrialization on the continent through the development of regional value chains and the more diversified nature of intra-African trade. South Africa is almost entirely self-sustaining in terms of food production. Consequently, tariff removal, cheaper agricultural products, and animal products from Africa may damage the sector. The AfCFTA undoubtedly holds the promise of significant opportunities for South Africa and could be an important catalyst in the igniting of the economy, but it should not be seen as the panacea for development, nor as a short-term fix for economic growth in our country. The developmental integration places an accent on market integration, infrastructure development, and industrial development to boost inter-Africa trade, which to date hovers at less than 20%. To this end, the developmental integration will support sustainable economic growth and structural transformation in the continent. In the light of the above, it would also be incumbent on South Africa to put its developmental integration paradigm approach in motion. For instance, infrastructure deficit in many African countries present an opportunity for these countries to source for infrastructure equipment from South Africa. Accordingly, it would augur well for South Africa to consider extending outward development finance that supports the major industrial and infrastructure projects in the continent. It is important to note that some individual economies and economic blocs are also prioritizing their domestic or regional recovery. Global economic integration comes with clear benefits through the access to the technologies and innovations from across the world. However, the benefits of highly integrated supply chains come with enormous vulnerabilities when they are disrupted, as we have witnessed during the onset of COVID-19. The AfCFTA provides opportunities for South Africa and SACU to grow domestic production and create more jobs in order to export more products to the North, West, Central, and East Africa. Since the inter-African trade is largely in value-added manufactured products, and the fact that over 3/4 of intra-African trade takes place within regional trading blocks, the AfCFTA should open opportunities for South Africa to produce and export to the African market more value-added manufacturing products to support sustainable jobs. In the wake of the current COVID-19 pandemic, e-commerce, digital trade has also been prioritized, and preparations for these negotiations will commence during the second half of 2021. South Africa has elaborated a number of key strategies to speed up economic recovery and build back better in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. In doing so, deeper integration of efforts to galvanize inclusive growth and build local industrial capacity has been identified as key strategic focus in achieving this. This will be achieved by uniting growth with transformation, boosting local production, growing exports, securing new investment, and expanding the green economy. It is thus important for South Africa to build a new model of growth and economic inclusion that unites South Africans in the economy and promotes transformation. On the exports front, South Africa's approach to continental and regional integration is to support a development-oriented integration process, that is market aggregation, integration to increase Africa trade, infrastructure development, and industrialization. The liberalization of the African markets through the implementation of the AfCFTA will create more opportunities to increase South African products and outward investments. Africa's trade with the rest of the world makes up to more than 80% of total African trade, resulting in a negative trade balance over the period 2013-2019, with an average of $372 billion for exports and $495 billion in imports. Strengthening intra-African trade is thus important for economic growth, development, and integration in the continent. The share of intra-African trade remains very low, on average 13% for intra-African imports and 20% for intra-African exports over the same period, 2013 to 2019. South Africa is the major player in intra-African trade, with a share of intra-African exports varying from 26 to 38 to 31% over the same period of 2013-2019, followed by Nigeria, which is 13.9% in 2019, and the DRC 7% in 2019. South Africa is also the leading player in intra-African imports at 14%, followed by Namibia 7% and Botswana at 6%. South Africa's exports into the rest of Africa grew from about 9 billion rand in 1994 to over 340 billion rand by 2019. South Africa's trade with the rest of Africa sustains about 250,000 jobs locally and contributes about 60 billion towards our economic output. South African companies invested in 40 African countries. The firms have invested about $36 billion, creating 54,000 jobs, and financed 420 projects in 25 sectors across the continent during the period 2003 to 2017. South Africa is the main driver of intra-Africa trade and amongst the top 10 investors in the continent. we need to maintain and build upon and consolidate this position. With regard to the DTIC's incentives to support South Africa's exports into the rest of Africa, the DTIC offers a whole range of incentives, and we will be implementing a package of actions, measures and programs designed to support South African companies to access markets in the rest of the continent. With regard to various monitoring mechanism, the single channel to report various, this has been established to ensure that the companies can immediately report any barriers that they may encounter, so that the DTIC can help in facilitation of dealing with those identified barriers. We have a dedicated resolution support, a long-term integration into economic diplomacy, clustering of priority barriers, and as you already indicated, the AfCFTA offers unprecedented opportunities on the continent, and building a conducive environment for the movement of goods in the region is key to unblocking the potential of the agreement. Honorable members, as we always say to many of our companies, that moving forward, as we plan our business strategies, we're no longer just looking at a market of 60 million people, but rather at a market of 1.3 billion people. With regard to opportunities flowing from the implementation of the AfCFTA, the AfCFTA will be accompanied by measures that facilitate trade through implementation of a trade facilitation agreement. And if successfully and fully implemented, the AfCFTA has the potential to generate sufficient economic benefits for the African countries and its long-suffering people. According to the World Bank report, the AfCFTA will see a significant boost in African trade, particularly inter-African regional trade in value-added goods, and a corresponding increase by almost 29% in the volume of total exports. It estimates that inter-African export would increase to 81%, while export to non-African countries would rise by 19%. Manufacturing exports would gain the most at 62% overall, with intra-African trade increasing by 110% and exports to the rest of the world rising by 46%. Trade in agricultural products would represent about 49% of inter-African trade and 10% of trade with the rest of the world. The World Bank also estimates that the AfCFTA economic and distributive effect will manage to lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and boost the incomes of nearly 68 million others who live on less than $5.5 a day. It will boost Africa's income by 450 billion by 2035, a gain of 7%, while adding 76 billion to the income of the rest of the world. Africa's exports will increase by $560 billion, mostly in manufacturing, and wages for women will increase by 10.5% and for men by 9.9%. Both skilled and unskilled workers will see an increase in their wages, with unskilled workers getting a 10.3% boost and unskilled workers getting a 9.8% boost. On opportunities for business, it is often said that Africa consumes what it does not produce and produces what it does not consume. African countries imported 8 trillion rand of goods in 2019, but only 1.1 trillion came from other African countries. Goods imported range from agriculture, automotive, chemicals, construction materials, equipment, and manufacturing fast-moving consumer goods. Lowering trade barriers presents a massive opportunity for South African industries for development across the continent. South Africa can produce and supply a significant share of these products. In addition, about 1.4 trillion US dollars worth of projects are at different stages of implementation across the African continent. These projects cover the following sectors: agriculture, oil and gas, construction, chemicals, transportation, manufacturing industries, water, and fisheries. Given that 10 million South Africans are jobless, we should see the AfCFTA as a jobs-driven strategy. Focus on expansion of labor-intensive sectors and those with strong rural and women employment linkages. Currently, 250 direct jobs are sustained by African exports. The rest of Africa imports 2.9 trillion worth of manufactured goods annually from outside Africa. If South Africa were to supply just 2% of these manufactured goods, it would add 1.2 percentage points to South Africa's GDP and add 60 billion rand to our economic output a year. African countries, excluding South Africa, imported goods worth 6 trillion from outside of Africa in 2019. Key imports of other African countries from outside the continent represent growth areas for South Africa, including in refined oil, automotive, agro-processing, clothing, textile, footwear, leather, iron and steel, plastics, and pharmaceuticals, and in investment in services sectors. South Africa exported 347 billion rand to other African countries in 2019, mainly to SADC countries, which is an important development. The AfCFTA provides opportunities for us to expand our exports to the north, the west, and to the east of the continent. Efforts to improve competitiveness of the sectors through industry master plans and financial support to upgrade local sectors are underway. To underpin the AfCFTA, a whole of government implementation plan will be put into effect during 2021. Each master plan will include an AfCFTA chapter. Key sectors include automotive, steel, poultry, sugar, agro-processing, clothing, and machinery. Provinces and districts will be assisted to identify both the opportunities for firms in their area and the local and provincial government contributions to realize their potential. We also aim to identify export champions that will support small and medium enterprises and Black industrialists to gear up for new markets. With regard to the role of the African Bureau of Ministers, South Africa was elected as chair of the AfCFTA implementation institutions during the 4th Council of Ministers of Trade held in February 2021. South Africa also chairs the subsidiary bodies, namely the Committee of Senior Officials, Committee of Trade in Goods, and Committee of Trade in Services. In addition, South Africa was also elected to chair the Dispute Settlement Body during its inaugural meeting held in May this year. Preparations for the phase 2 negotiations have also commenced. In this regard, South Africa has also been elected to chair the expert groups on investment in intellectual property. The work on competition and e-commerce is expected to commence in the later part of 2020. With South Africa's chairing of these bureaus, particularly the Council of Ministers, we are better placed to provide leadership in harmonizing the appropriate policies, strategies to enable implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is also to be noted that South Africa negotiates through SACU. In this view, galvanizing the support of SACU and coordinating with like-minded member states and state parties in harmonizing appropriate policies and strategies can be undertaken more efficiently. Honorable Chairperson, in conclusion, on this day, we must reflect on what it means to be an African. It is clear that the institutional capacity, integration, and policy harmony are essential to the comprehensive success of our efforts in the continent, the regions, and amongst nations. We must never neglect to invest into these efforts as we invest in finding convergence on all fronts of continental cooperation. We must undertake this task inspired by Isitola Ndwesapharang, Nelson Mandela's affirmation that when people are determined, they can overcome anything. Notwithstanding the COVID-19 pandemic, several African countries remain among the fastest growing economies in the world. Over the past 2 decades, the continent has experienced consistent levels of high economic growth with an ever-expanding middle class, which is projected to reach about 600 million by 2030, characterized by a dynamic and ever-increasing young population with a growing spending power. Driven largely by public sector spending, over the past couple of years, we have seen a steady flow of investments into critical infrastructure. These investments have served as a necessary catalyst for attracting private sector investment in manufacturing and other sectors of the economy. For example, between 2016 and 2019, over $1.85 trillion worth of construction projects broke ground across Africa, covering over 13 subsectors such as education, energy, healthcare, oil and gas, real estate, mining, water, shipping and ports, mining and social development. This level of spending and developments are unlocking significant opportunities for African companies to supply higher volumes of capital goods and services, including consumables such as steel products, electricity, transmission lines, electricity cables, transmission lines, substations, railway tracks, rolling stocks, and so on and so forth. If properly harnessed, these ingredients enhance Africa's economic prospects and can be leveraged to bolster Africa's potential to generate more wealth for its vast population over the short, medium, and long term. As the continent's most advanced and one of the largest economies, South Africa's social and economic prospect is intricately linked and intertwined to that of the development of the rest of the continent. Hence, South Africa must adopt a deliberate and Africa-centric posture aimed at mobilizing its capabilities, and that is financial, technical, and institutional capacity, including leveraging its ability to access and deploy world-scale technologies through strategic partnerships with fellow African countries and strategic partnerships from all corners of the world to advance and support the implementation of the AfCFTA. The success of the African continental free trade area depends on our collective efforts and coordinated action to effectively implement the program and achieve the vision that our forebears set out for us decades ago. I will conclude by reiterating the words of President Ramaphosa when he said, and I quote, "As we observe Africa Day, let us deepen our efforts to achieve a sustainable and lasting social and economic recovery for the citizens of Africa. Ours must become a continent that is thriving and prosperous, not one from which its people are dying in an attempt to live. Forward to a successful African continental free trade area." I thank you, Deputy Chairperson of the NCOP.
Thank you very much, DM. We can give some applause. Thank you very much, DM. Like I've already said, he's coming with a wealth of information. And I think at this stage, I will use my liberty as a chairperson of this session to give some few opportunities for inputs if anyone want to make inputs now, whilst the information is still fresh, before we will continue with the program. Can I have an indication if there is anyone that want to just engage a little bit with this specific input now? Because if that is not the case, we will continue. Yes, I had a colleague who always said when people don't input, it means it is clear as mud. So since it is very clear, and I think it is a very, very, very really fruitful input, particularly for us that want to understand better the issues around the free trade area agreement. So we will continue with our program, particularly since last year, our theme was silencing the guns. We want to then now call on the Honorable Dangor to speak a little bit on issues of peacekeeping with regards to Africa's economic recovery. Honorable Dangor, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chairperson of the NCOP, Deputy Minister, Honorable Chief Whip, honorable members, ladies and gentlemen, compatriots and fellow South Africans. The theme is pioneering Africa's inclusive economic recovery and free trade levers for building an Africa that we want, peacekeeping and Africa's economic recovery. I will deal in the beginning with some of the opportunities that the agreement presents, and then I will deal with some of the risks that we also have in Africa. We are for African unity on a regional or continental scale as far as it is necessary for the progress of the African peoples. And in order to guarantee their security and the continuity of this progress, this was a speech made at the third conference of the African peoples held in Cairo in March 25th to 31st, 1961 by Amilcar Cabral. I'm extremely honored to address this House today, which is an extremely important day for our continent. Today we celebrate Africa. We do so under the auspicious theme of arts, culture, and heritage, levers for building the Africa we want. Africa Day, as we all know, is done to commemorate the founding of the Organization of the African Unity. Thus, we celebrate Africa Day. We celebrate the legacy and principles of Pan-Africanism, of African human solidarity, unity, social cohesion, and diversity, amongst others. When we celebrate Africa Day, we celebrate and commemorate and reflect upon the legacies of Kwame Nkrumah, of Robert Sobukwe, of Julius Nyerere, of Cabral, of Ahmad Sekou, of Frantz Fanon, of Patrice Lumumba, of Ahmad Bembela, of Thomas Sankara, of Abdul Nasser, of Samora Machel, upon O.R. Tambo, and Nelson Mandela, amongst others. As we reflect on the progress that we have made and the challenges that we are confronted with, both in the past and the present, we must do so within the context of our political, social, cultural, and economic liberation of our continent and its people. To this end, we must reflect on the progress we have made in fighting and overcoming colonialism, imperialism, and apartheid. We must also reflect upon the extent of our economic liberation as Africa, as well as our cultural and social liberation. It is right that Africans have been extremely successful in ensuring our political emancipation from colonialism and apartheid. Today, there remains only one country in Africa, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. Western Sahara, as we know it, is ironically colonized by another African country, Morocco. The battle for economic liberation, which is the second leg of the Pan-Africanism, has however been much more protected and equally challenging. Our Pan-Africanist founding fathers correctly analyzed for there to be true liberation, we need economic liberation. And in order to achieve economic liberation, we need economic unity and the integration of Africa. Yet our post-colonial history in the last decade indicates that as Africa, we have not been economically united. Our infrastructure, policies, legislations, and agreements for trade and development were all geared towards favoring our former colonizers. It is a well-known legend that in Africa, all our rail and road infrastructure lead to the ports in order that our raw materials and commodities are exported. Our commodities have been for too long been extractive and commodity-based as opposed to being inclusive and diversified. It is therefore not surprising that the share of African exports as a percentage of total African exports has only increased from 10% in 1995 to approximately 17% in 2017. It thus remains low compared to the levels in Europe, which is 69%, Asia, which is 59%, and North America, which is 31%. In 1990 and in 2014, the most fastest growing economies in the world diversified their economies. Most African countries instead relied upon rents from extractive industries rather than diversity. Exports from Central and Northern Africa became increasingly more concentrated, even countries with diversified exports, as South Africa lost ground. Thus, over the past decades, Africa has started a bottom-up process of economic integration. The 8 regional economic hubs, which is the Maghreb Union, the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, the Community of Saharan States, known as SANSAD, the East African Community, the Economic Community of Central African States, the Economic Community of West African States, and the Intergovernmental Authority of Development called IGAD. Southern Africa and SADC. These are established under a separate regional treaties with the purpose of achieving regional integration and then continental integration. It is against this backdrop today that we have much to celebrate. After years of hard work, in 2012, the EU formally agreed to usher in a continental free trade zone. That in 2018, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was founded in order to ensure continental integration of the 8 RECs. It commenced on the 1st of January 2021, and at the end of 2020, there were 54 signatories, of which 36 were ratified. 3 countries that have ratified but not yet deposited their ratification are Cameroon, Angola, and Somalia. Honorable members, as so eloquently initiated by the Deputy Minister, the ACFTA is expected to enable countries to break into new African markets as they both diversify by export destination and type of goods produced. According to modeling results by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the ACFTA is a game changer, which could stimulate and increase the value of inter-African exports. It is projected to increase the value of inter-African trade by 15% or $50 billion, and 25% or $70 billion, depending on the liberalization efforts by 2040. Alternatively, the share of inter-African trade would increase by nearly 40% to over 50% between 2020 and 2040. According to the World Bank report on ACFA says the following in July 2020. ACFA presents the opportunity for African countries to bring 30 million people out of extreme poverty and to raise the incomes of 68 million others who live on less than $5.5 a day. With the implementation of ACFA trade facilitation measures that would cut red tape and simplify customs procedures would drive 222 billion of the 450 billion to potential income gains. Furthermore, the World Bond Report on ACFA says that The ACFA agreement will create the largest free trade area in the world measured by the number of countries participating. The pact connects 1.3 billion people across 55 countries with a combined gross domestic product valued at 3.4 million. It has the potential to lift 30 million people out of poverty. Key findings of the World Bank 20 July 2020 includes the following. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement represents a major opportunity for countries to boost trade, reduce poverty, and broaden economic inclusion. Under ACFA, extreme poverty would decline across the continent, with the biggest improvements in countries with currently the highest poverty rates. West Africa would see the biggest decline in the number of people living in extreme poverty. $450 billion of the income grants from ACFA would come from a stronger trade facilitation and measures to reduce red tape to simplify customs procedures. Honorable Chairperson and colleagues, creating a continent-wide market will require a determined effort to reduce the trade costs. In general, this will require legislation and regulations to enable the free flow of goods, capital, and information across borders, create competitive business environments that can boost productivity and investment and competition, and attract foreign direct investment that can raise productivity and innovation. In a few sectors facing job losses, governments will need to support workers with adequate safety nets and policies to retrain workers. Achieving the gains from ACFA, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is expected to cause up to 79 billion output losses in Africa, COVID-19 has caused major disruptions to trade across the continent, including critical goods such as medical supplies and goods. By increasing regional trade, lower trading costs, and streamlining border procedures, full implementation of the agreement would help African countries to increase their resilience in the face of future economic shocks and help usher in the kind of deep reforms that are necessarily required. Honorable members, let us be precise. For us, the African Revolution means the transformation of our present life in the direction of progress. The prerequisite for this is the elimination of foreign economic domination on which every type of domination is dependent. This again was said by Cabral in Cairo in 1961. I have emphasized the positive spin-offs and advantages of the launch and implementation. However, one of the key threats and impediments to the successful implementation of the agreement is our continent's history of war and conflict, which results in consistent political and economic instability. Regional and continental integration cannot take place if our rail, and I think yesterday the Minister of Transport was talking about the rail that has been lifted in our country. And this, in fact, is counter-revolution. And I think these people that have lifted and stripped the rails should be charged for treason, for economic treason. Damaged by war. Investors, innovators, and entrepreneurs will not invest in countries that are made unstable due to internal civil wars as well as regional wars. Political instability results in economic instability. Potential young entrepreneurs and innovators are maimed and killed, and there is a loss of our domestic, regional, and continental conflict. In 2018 alone, Africa experienced an increase in civil wars to 21. This is the highest number of civil conflicts since 1946, with 21 also recorded in 2015 and 2016 and 2019. There were at least 15 countries with active armed conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa: Burkina Faso, Burundi, Cameroon, the CAR, Chad, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mali, Mozambique, and Nigeria and Somalia. South Sudan and Sudan, while non-state conflict in Africa has been on the rise over the past 5 years. Africa's most populous country, Ethiopia, that hosts the African Union, is now sliding into a civil war, whose humanitarian and security consequences could dwarf those of neighboring Somalia and South Sudan. The crisis centers on the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia, along the Eritrean border. We are still nowhere to resolving the conflict between Morocco and the Sahrawi. Africa's quest to foster Pan-Africanism and integration through the agreement could be futile unless deliberate steps are made to guarantee peace and security in the continent. Africa is largely fragmented ethnically and is home to some of the world's most protected armed insurgencies and conflicts. The political violence, perhaps, explaining why intra-African trade accounts for only 18% of the trade. Recognizing the need to prioritize trade is a tool for addressing Africa's development and challenges. During January 2012, the African Union Summit, the EU set in motion an ambitious initiative, not only for trade in goods and services, but also intellectual property rights, investments as part of Agenda 2063 flagship. In line with this, ACPA aims to boost intra-African trade by 53.2%. Africa is largely fragmented and ethnically is home to some of the world's most protected armed insurgencies, conflicts, and political violence. I want to just turn to an issue that was raised by Professor Zondi. And he says, what types of conflicts that we have in Africa? Among the conflict that cuts across the country reports for the African peer review mechanism, the APRM, with the electoral violence and land-based conflict, while salient causes or factors contributing to conflict with ethnic, religious diversity, inequality, and poverty. Peace and stability, which is absolutely necessary for the economic development. There cannot be socio-economic development in an environment of peace, instability. Stability is a precondition for social economic development. Writing in the Strategic Review for Southern Africa in 2019, Professor Zondi says the following: the question of peace and stability is a precondition for development, and prosperity is a major concern for the region of Southern Africa. This arises because much has been done to deepen the peace, while the outcomes may be tenuous and unassured. A lot of work has gone into building stability, especially of states, including the public service system, but these may not have resulted in improved prosperity. The regional integration is premised on developmentalism, making explicit the link between security, stability, and development. The structures to advance this has been cut in place, both at the regional and local levels, and these should be effective. He goes on to say, the question remains as to whether peace and stability may yield the desired development and prosperity. But if we take the case of South Africa, the socio-economic development in South Africa post-1994 far surpasses the economic development of South Africa prior to that. It can be argued that this development is largely a result of peaceful environment created after 1994. Correctly, Zondi may be arguing that there are other factors which may yield the desired development, not only peace and stability. This view cannot be ignored. If we take, for example, Libya, we'll come to the conclusion that Libya had been, at that particular point, the envy of many countries in terms of socio-economic development. However, the events of 2011 have turned things for the worst. Libya's path has been tumultuous. Despite the number of advantages compared with other post-conflict societies, progress on the political, economic, and security fronts has fallen far behind, generating frustration, threatening the recovery altogether, and Libya is teetering and still teetering on the brink of a relapse into a civil war on more than one occasion in the past. What is the solution? It's Africa's challenges to find African solutions to African problems. And the West, in fact, the countries of NATO that had actually supported or initiated the conflict in Libya did so against the background of really seeking to take what former President Mbeki said, the curse of resources, to take the resources of Libya for nothing. In fact, if you go back into Africa, it starts with the invasion of the Cape by the Dutch East India Company. Nothing has changed since then. In Africa, they go to war for resources. If we look at what's happening in Mozambique at the moment, we need to examine why is there ISIS every time when there's gas or when there's oil. There was no ISIS recently in Palestine, but there's ISIS in Syria, there's oil and gas. There's ISIS, there's in northern Mozambique, there's oil and gas, you find an ISIS. The question is, how do we deal with this? African solutions to African questions are important. Former President Mbeki was affirming the protected struggle that Africa fought and the appreciation that that development can only happen in an environment of peace and stability. He was also outlining the tasks ahead of the African people in integrating the economy in the continent, and he was under no illusion that the integration of Africa would be easy. Chairperson, the Nigeria and Ghana trade tensions are proof that the agreement may not just bring the unity. Occasionally, changes have come into the local population that have a direct influence on the decision to participate in violent conflicts for violent groups. Chairperson, in conclusion, I want to say the following. We are sure of the solidarity of all the African peoples in our struggle. We are conscious of the fact that our struggle for national liberation does not only serve our own peoples, it also serves the fundamental interests of all the peoples of Africa and the world, Cabral. If we want to achieve our goal of economic liberation through economic and social and cultural integration, we must ensure that we meet our goal of silencing the guns in Africa. As a country, we must use all our resources and energies at a bilateral level, as well as at the multilateral level, through our regional organizations such as SADC, our continental and global and multilateral organizations such as the African Union and the United Nations, to focus on ending conflicts where they are currently in existence. We must also ensure that our foreign policy remains geared towards preventing conflict where they are threatening to emerge or to re-emerge. It is imperative that our foreign policy must protect the African Union and protect this in particular agreement for Africa's independence, unity, and sovereignty. Our foreign policy priorities need to focus on conflict management, conflict resolution, and mediation. It needs to focus on conflict prevention through neutralization and stabilization, through the deployment of our troops as part of the regional and continental global peace. We further need to ensure that we focus upon post-conflict reconstruction and development of countries emerging from conflict through the provision of development aid and other resources to strengthen governance and rebuild infrastructure. Our foreign policy must be geared towards assisting with the development of an integrated continental legislative and policy architecture and systems that will harmonize the economic integration and free flow of goods and people. Without unity, there is no future for Africa, said the late President Julius Nyerere. I want to advocate, Chairperson, that maybe we should start persuading our leadership to look at the kind of Monroe document for Africa, to look at African solutions to African problems, that other people, in fact, in other countries, come to Africa and to other countries in the world to extract the resources. And most of the wars are really resource-based, and the curse of resources is really what we deal with, and that is what we must overcome. And that's the partnerships that we need to seek. And with that, I thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Honorable Dango. Let me thank you very much really for two very profound inputs, very good and also very informative. We will we just want to really express our appreciation to the two speakers so far. That is really enlightening us with a lot of and empowering us with a lot of information. We really appreciate that. We also appreciate those that are watching on the different platforms as well as on the direct broadcast. We want to acknowledge also those people that are watching this lecture. And then we will, after the input, the video that will be flighted now, we will then request the Honorable Nyambi to take over the presiding over this proceedings when the next presenter will then come. Can we then now see the video?
It means asserting our collective and individual identity as Africans, committed to the rebirth of the continent, being respectful of other citizens, and honoring women and children of our country who are exposed to all kinds of domestic violence and abuse. And when I say Africans, I mean everybody whose continent of Africa is their home.
I am an African. The Constitution, whose adoption we celebrate, constitutes an unequivocal statement that we refuse to accept that our Africanness shall be defined by our race, our color, our gender, or our historical origins. It seeks to create a situation in which all our people shall be free from fear, including the fear of oppression of one national group by another, the fear of the disempowerment of one social echelon by another, the fear of the use of state power to deny anybody their fundamental human rights, and the fear of tyranny.
In keeping with the key objective of striving for a better Africa, we have over the last 15 years of democracy steadily lent a helping hand in the peacekeeping and peacemaking and post-conflict reconstruction efforts on our continent. All of us move from the common understanding that we need to continue to fulfill our international responsibility, especially on the African continent, to help bring about a better Africa and a better world.
This year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the birth of the Organization of African Unity, which has been succeeded by the African Union. We pay tribute to the AU for its relentless struggle for the decolonization of our continent, including contributing to our own freedom. will continue to work for a stronger and more effective organization of our union.
The relations between our people are not only of friendship, but essentially of identity and closest affinities. We constitute an ample and unique space. Our citizens know no boundaries. They regard themselves as an integral part of each of our countries.
Africa must assume responsibility for settling its own problems, adapting the continent to world changes in various domains, completing the political, economic, and social reforms designed to establish the necessary platform for achieving global and sustainable growth and ensuring security, stability, and well-being in line with the correlation we have recommended between growth and democracy.
Izinto ezithenga phaka lokho. Wazithenga izinto phaka kwelikhala ezikahle ngokunabo.
Thank you. Colleagues, Deputy Chairperson, Chief Whip, special delegates from our provinces, special guests, allow me now to take this opportunity to invite Professor Gumede, who is a Dean of the Faculty of Economic Development and Business from the University of Mpumalanga. Professor Gumede, focused on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
Okay.
Prof.
Greetings, honorable members. And
Hi, Prof.
apologies for coming in a bit late. We had another session I indicated to the organizers. Unfortunately, we had another Africa Day event. So can I start? Should I start?
Yes, you can start, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much. Apologies again. I'm going to share my screen so that the presentation can be seen. The host needs to allow me to share the presentation, please.
You can share now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I hope honorable members can see.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk briefly about the African Continental Free Trade Area, as I was requested, touch on the opportunities and the threats, and also reflect on the oversight role of Parliament in relation to this particular initiative, a very important initiative. As we all know, the African Continental Free Trade Area is now being implemented. It was entered into in 2018 or came into force, and now is being implemented, which is a historic milestone, as many have been saying. It's a very significant step in the economic integration agenda in Africa. There are various elements of the agreement, but I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I saw that the Deputy Minister was presenting on a similar issue earlier. So I'll just highlight, you've got three main parts. The part that deals with what the agreement intends to achieve, its scope, its principles, and the definition of terms, as well as institutional and various procedures and protocols, dealing with trade in services, trade in goods, trade in goods, trade in services, rules and procedures in relation to the settlement of disagreements, investment, competition. So it's quite comprehensive. I think that's the main issue, really, that the agreement is quite comprehensive, dealing with a whole range of issues, particularly around the protocols. Some are not yet resolved. So these are the issues perhaps that members of Parliament can pay more attention to. We say it's a historic and a significant milestone because it lays a foundation. The Continental Free Trade Agreement lays a foundation for the establishment of a Continental Customs Union and at a later stage to create a single market for Africa. This is a key issue, really, because if you think about countries, say China, India, can think of United States of America, and a few other countries, that you are able to develop in economic terms because you have a slightly bigger single market. Here in Africa, we've got a challenge of, countries that are arguably relatively small and are unable to stand on their own to trade effectively, and because of that, it's a constraint. We know why. These are issues that relate to our ugly past as Africans. The 1984-1985 Berlin Conference that inappropriately or incorrectly carved up different parts of our continent into countries that really can't do much. There are bigger problems because of that, of course, where you divide people, same, cultural group, people with, same language, you move them, to what you think of as another country and others in another country. Part of the reason also why we have so many conflicts in the continent. For those who are in the Pan-African movement and working hard, those that are, dream and pursue Pan-Africanism, we see the African Continental Free Trade Area as a great step towards the political unification of African countries into a single African nation. And many of us who, well, there are those of us, well, there are many of us who believe that this is really the future for Africa, that many of our challenges in the African continent we won't be able to resolve until we unite and correct the mistake, redress the problem that was created in 1984 and 1985. So you can think of an African continental trade area. The next step is the African Economic Community, and through that, political issues can be pursued, ideological issues must be pursued. So although the African Continental Free Trade Area is really an economic agenda, and some of us have criticized it for that, but of course you have to start somewhere as an economic agenda, as a trade instrument, but that you're able to, over time, also address very important political issues, ideological issues that the continent has to address. We are finally here in the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was envisaged long ago in 1991 in the Abuja Treaty, which envisioned the establishment of the African Economic Community. And our calculation, I think most people put the number approximately 30 years, the way it was envisaged in the Abuja Treaty. And some of us think that we're not far off within that 30 years. There are those, who are quick to say the Abuja Treaty has failed, that we've digressed. Some of us argue that, not by many years. Some things are really hard, given our political history as a continent. It's understandable to a large extent why it's taken us so long to get to this point, this historic milestone that we've now reached. Regional economic communities are extremely important because they were envisaged by the Abuja Treaty as the building blocks. So, for the African Economic Community, for the common market, for the single market, all of that needed to, the way the Abuja Treaty envisaged it, it needed to go through the regional economic communities. And this is really a key issue because it's not very clear what's going to happen. Now we're starting to implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is really good. And maybe some of the issues will then be addressed, through the implementation processes. But, when this was starting, some of us were worried that we've not really addressed this issue about what's going to happen to the regional economic communities, and we're already implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area. We had raised also a concern regarding the tripartite free trade area. A lot of effort had gone into that, and it was just so close to enter into force, and it got overtaken by the African Continental Free Trade Area. So some of us felt that these are issues that need to be addressed, but of course, I think we're all very pleased that we're at the point where we're implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area now. Just some few concepts so that we're all talking from the same understanding. Regional integration is a process where countries agree to connect in a region, in a sub-region, in a continent, to pursue cooperation and coordination. Often this is in economic terms, economic integration, but also it could relate to political, could relate to cultural and security related issues. And when you establish an economic community, this entails complete abolition. You abolish completely any barriers to trade. Could be tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers. And a monetary union is when countries agree, so they enter into an agreement to create a single currency area. And of course, we need a single central bank for this, or existing central banks integrate and form a common central banking system. With regards to the customs union, we're talking about different countries that enter into a free trade area with a common external tariff. And those that are non-members of that agreement, of that customs union, have the same treatment. In other words, there's a common external tariff for all of them. And lastly, the common market, which is the first bullet point actually, which is, you're really adding the free movement of people, of goods, of services, of capital, whereas a single market subsequently removing all possible constraints. We know about these regional economic communities in our continent, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them, except to mention that they've evolved differently. So some arguably have a higher level, deepened level of integration, while others still have a long way to go. And I think this is an issue that needs to be addressed leading up to the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And of course, like the World Trade Organization guides or prescribes, we followed a principle of differentiate. So countries are allowed that they can integrate at different stages, which may be a bit of a challenge for us in the continent. And these are the communities that we have. I think we can all see them. And when it comes to customs unions or monetary communities in the continent, the oldest and the one that we all know about, Southern African Customs Union, which many of us have argued that there are a lot of lessons we can draw from this. Of course, it was an accident of history, maybe a history that we're not proud of, how it came about, but so many lessons that can be drawn if we think about a monetary community, and a missed opportunity, arguably, in Southern Africa, whether we couldn't have worked with SACU for a much deepened regional integration agenda in economic terms. I mean, Southern Africa, really, we have no problem politically. I think culturally, we're probably the most integrated sub-region in the continent, in my view, than many other sub-regions, perhaps, across the world. But in economic terms, I think we've missed some opportunities. There could have been a lot of lessons that could have been drawn from that. And then these other ones, unfortunately, some still largely controlled by the French, as you can see, the CFA franc in West Africa and Central Africa. Some things that we need to address politically. There's some change, of course. There've been movements. There've been a lot of political activity to push back, France, and I think there are some improvements there. It is important to highlight that none of these monetary unions, even SACU, is conterminous with an existing right. So even SACU, if you think about SACU and think about SADC, a very big disjuncture. And this is something some of us felt that needed to be addressed before the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Some of these customs unions, are kind of a distinct island of a deeper integration, either within or adjacent to the regional economic community. And of course, I've just given an example of SACU. Some of the RECs have progressed towards financial and monetary union, and others even further. So if you think about the East African community, for instance, which aspires for a political federation of that particular sub-region, has advanced quite extensively for many years. And again, some of us argued that we could draw lessons from that experience. You've got ECOWAS in West Africa, fully liberalized trade, while here in SADC, we've achieved some free trade agreement, but there are some exclusions from liberalization. This was just to show, in terms of economic convergence, because it's very critical. So when we think about an African, or say a continental free trade area, or even in a regional sense or sub-regional sense, one of the key issues that we have to address is whether the economic indicators, whether economic policy converge over time. And this relates to coordination. So here, it's just trying to show in the context of SADC what it aspired for and where we are. Very big gaps between the different countries. Same thing with ECOWAS. There's some of what ECOWAS aspired for. And when you look at evidence of what has happened, still a long way to go. So, as I said, the East African community, arguably the most advanced regional economic community. I mean, I spent some time in Arusha studying this particular regional economic community while I moved around at it, studied many different regional economic communities, doing some work around this. And I left Arusha really convinced that this is where we should be drawing lessons, also of what to avoid, the mistakes. So, the African community arguably should have achieved the political federation by now, as aspired. But, there have been issues around, leadership, largely. I can't talk too loudly about that. I think we all know, but of course, sometimes external influence that slows down progress for many of our countries and regional economic communities. COMESA in the Eastern and Southern Africa is pursuing a coordination program which was adopted in 1992, and with the hope that there will be a monetary union in 2025. There's not much for the Community of Sahel and Sub-Saharan states. They did not really explicitly aspire or even indicate any hope for financial and economic convergence. And this is a challenge because it's important that regional economic communities are explicit about economic convergence. So, I've just published a paper on this particular issue very recently, is you can't have very different economic indicators, particularly interest rates, economic growth, inflation, and you believe that as a regional community, you can really converge and make an impact, trade, and advance development in your own sub-region. This is very important, for Africa, unlike other regions or continents. We trade very little amongst ourselves. Of course, these numbers are looking at formal trade that's recorded. Arguably, trade is much bigger than this. In the African continent, we published a book that was looking at regional integration and migration in Africa with colleagues when we had the Taumbe African Leadership Institute about 3 years ago. And we actually came to a conclusion that there was a lot of trade that was taking place, cross-border informal trade that may not be recorded. So the numbers, of course, have to be treated by suspicion. But even in that case, if you look at how the different economic communities in Africa trade with the rest of the world relative to trading amongst ourselves, it's disappointing. We should have done better than this. And things that we have to worry about, trade amongst ourselves in Africa, even lower than the trade with China, lower than the trade with the United States. It tells us something going on. And heads of states, are very conscious of this issue. They've been advised and they've deliberated on it and made strong arguments about how we should prioritize intra-African trade. But countries, even here in South Africa, you read in the newspapers or here that there's some discussion going on with European Union or some country for trade. And some of us think that this is a constraint. We shouldn't be focusing on trade in the continent. And there are many ways of thinking about it. I mean, there was a time, me and a colleague did some work and argued, we published on this, we argued that it should be possible for Africa to divide the continent economically, say in 4 or 5 blocks, say Southern Africa, not just SADC, but Southern Africa, and you focus on manufacturing, say East Africa, not just those few countries, but that are, parts of the East African, but, the whole block in East Africa, perhaps, focusing on services, IT and so forth. And over time, we're able to trade. I mean, this also touches on the issues of communication, of language, which some people have argued that's a constraint. So, also think about how could you, in a particular sub-region, say Southern Africa or, East Africa, a common language that over time we build into a lingua franca for the continent. I mean, that debate is not resolved, of course. So there are many. We're having Professor Kwesi Kwapa here at UMP was giving the Africa Day lecture earlier, who was actually arguing that, that's not, we shouldn't be doing that. You don't need a single language for the continent. Our languages, converge and we can understand each other. In a sense, taking forward the work that Chekata Diop had done a while back, demonstrating that Africans, from cultural point of view, language point of view, were not as dissimilar as we've been made to believe. I've mentioned this point about the tripartite free trade agreement. For some of us, we thought something is, not going well, that we had invested so much energy on a tripartite free trade agreement. This is an agreement that was made up of the 3 blocks. So the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa, SADC, and the East African community, which, is plus minus 60% really, maybe 70 of trade, within the continent. And you just need to get other countries on board and build up to the common market that way, the way it seems to have done. Maybe there's, a good explanation for this, why, the tripartite free trade area seems to have been overtaken by the African continental free trade area. Of course, the African continental free trade area is what we want, but I think at the time, some of us felt we had already invested so much energy on the tripartite free trade agreement, and we needed to ensure that that works. And we had learned a lot of lessons, which actually informed the African continental free trade agreement. If you look at, the agreement itself, its instruments, it draws a lot from the tripartite free trade agreement. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk about theories. It's what we like as academics. I think what probably is important is the history of integration, but also, given that I'm talking to members of parliament, politicians know this history very well. The point I would like to make is, it is not true that economic integration has never been in the agenda in Africa. So you hear some people who say, oh, this, as if it comes up, it's a new thing, it comes with a butcher treat. When in fact, it's always been a priority, and there's enough evidence to support this. If we listen to the speeches of our leaders, at independence, or just before political independence, for many countries in Africa, strong emphasis on integration, particularly from a political point of view. So it's been with us for a very long time. However, we've had these different schools of thought about how we approach unity in Africa. And there's some controversial things to say here from my point of view, but I think I'll not say much about that. I've written about, the challenge that we take certain things for granted. So, for us to pursue regional integration in Africa and as Africans, we need to be mindful of external influences and of course the ugly history of the continent, but also that you can't really have, both Pan-Africanism and Pan-Arabism. I know this is a very controversial point, but some scholars have written about it, and I think it's a very important issue for us to take into account. I've written about it, but I don't have to say much about it here. And that preoccupation with regional integration in Africa since independence, or even before independence, actually showed the results. So contrary to what many people think of Africa as, really we've never had high levels of growth. It's untrue. I just calculated some numbers using the very same World Bank, that nobody has terrible things to say about Africa. And you can see the numbers show for themselves that actually growth in gross domestic product in Africa has been really high. You think about countries, such as Botswana, minute after independence, Kenya, even Malawi, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa is an outlier, of course, because we're a latecomer. But it just shows that, there was growth in terms of per capita, income per head. If you look at the recent period, and the point I'd like to make here is that because we've not been able to integrate effectively in the continent, development is not advancing, well-being is not improving. And you see it in many ways. You see it in per capita income, which have been declining of late. Of course, COVID has added, and perhaps mismanagement of our economies. But you also see it in human development and other important indicators. For instance, if you look at human development, really, most of our countries are not doing very well. Our own country, South Africa, not growing really in terms of advancing well-being. And if you think about it in a regional context, we're the slowest in terms of human development. Our levels are very low, which is hard to explain for a continent that is so rich, as many have said, and there's evidence to demonstrate how rich our continent is in many ways. But human development remains very low. This is very interesting if you think, since roughly 10 years after independence in Africa, manufacturing share of GDP, so how, for instance, manufacturing was contributing to gross domestic product. You can think of output, employment, as economists relate this. And there was a time from about 1984 to, 1992, where manufacturing in GDP was growing. If you look at this, you look at employment numbers actually, going with this. But ever since then, really, we've been declining steeply, quite steeply, suggesting that there's something we're not doing well. Of course, it's not just only the Africans or, our leadership and ourselves. There's a lot of influence also from outside, and some mistakes perhaps we made about how we liberalized too fast, speedily, and this has been a problem in the continent. Some countries, of course, like South Africa, who did it, who did worse. Well, we thought we were doing it right because we thought the market would respond to this, and then there'll be foreign direct investment. But in many instances, this doesn't happen. So some critical issues for the members of parliament, and I'm concluding now. There are a number of issues that some of us felt were not resolved. The agreement itself, not going far enough. This was a big issue, but of course you have to start somewhere. So the kind of the trade liberalization threshold that's envisaged in the agreement is lower, actually lower than what the Abuja Treaty expected. And if you look at the various regional economic communities, envisaging much higher levels of liberalization and integration, and that's a challenge because if you have regions that are, it's a good thing, it's a good problem to have because it's important that trade has been deepened. and integration has deepened in many of the regions, and that's in a sense a step towards the African economic community. But it's a challenge, I suppose, you could argue, for the continental free trade area, because we're dealing with these different levels of integration. There's an issue around inter-country and international dynamics. I mean, these are political issues that I think members of parliament will be alive to. The big issue really are external threats, in my view. Some people think that overlap in memberships as well of the countries in various regional economic communities is a problem. But maybe this the continental free trade area addresses this, because we now have a single continental free trade agreement. So it shouldn't really be an issue that a country, it shouldn't be a problem that a country may be belonging to different regional economic. But there are external threats really that we should be alive to. So some of us worry a lot about China, for instance. For many years we've worried about Europe, we've worried about North America, but it seems to us, to some of us, that we should really be focusing on ourselves, in the African continent, and ensuring that we develop our own capacities, our own capabilities in the manufacturing, in the services, and other areas, than what seems to be, a lot of interaction and trade with China, and of course the economic partnership agreements. I mean, they have to come to an end. So there's a lot of political work that some of us are involved with, because we think this is a problem. So you can't have countries or some of the regions entering into economic partnership agreements when in fact we should be focusing on the continent to improve intra-Africa trade. But the point to make is that our leaders are aware of these issues, so I'm just highlighting them. So in the various AU summits, these issues are raised, and leaders say some of it's even recorded. Countries shouldn't be entering into bilateral trade agreements, but the countries do it, which is a strange thing, because you can't do it without ratification. So it's confusing when you have our leaders meet in Addis Ababa or wherever, agree that don't do this because it's a problem. We know it's a problem. It's going to be a problem for us, but countries still do this. There are complex issues, but we're in the implementation phase now, so I'm not going to belabor these points. It may very well be that some of the challenges get resolved through implementation. I mean, the big issue around the rules of origin, for instance, there are those of us who felt that needed to be addressed more far before we got to this level. It's a very complex issue. Customs unions struggled with it. Regional economic communities have struggled with it, even in the context of the tripartite free trade area, and then you have countries that are members of certain regional economic communities, but have not signed the free trade agreement of that regional economic community. And then these were some of the issues that we felt needed attention before we start implementation. But we're implementing now, so we have to make sure that we implement well, and some of these issues may very well be addressed through implementation. The point I was talking about, this principle of most favored nation, some of the things that we take from the WTO variable geometry principle, and all of that, whether we really needed to copy that. It might very well be that maybe we didn't have much option, but some of us think this could be a constraint. So if you allow countries, to integrate differently over time, are you ever really going to reach the correct level of a customs, continental customs, a continental, single market? Among other critical issues, a free trade area is amongst the other issues in relation to a free trade area is economic convergence, and I've already spoken about this. I've written a bit about this, that we really haven't approached the issue comprehensively, and perhaps the implementation phase will be addressing this kind of issues well. Policy coordination, countries, within countries, we struggle to coordinate policy, and then it's not a shortage of capacity. Something goes on, here in South Africa, for instance, we've seen what has happened in the past, 12, 15 years, weaknesses in coordination compromising, development, affecting economic development. And now you have to coordinate at a continental level. So you need policy coherence, central banking, monetary policy. And these are the issues that some of us felt should have been given more attention, particularly at the regional economic committee level. And yeah, I made points about coordination and coordinating inflation and so forth. And then drawing lessons. Yeah, that's what I want to make, drawing lessons, from other regions, other, economic communities, from other, continental free trade areas, even where it didn't work. I think, it's useful to have looked at that closely. Why, for instance, ASEAN didn't maybe advance fast enough, or Mercosur, such examples. And then lastly, the most important issue, but I think this is a political issue and has to be addressed, implementation on, in my view, address this big political issue. And I suppose one of the issues that members of parliament may want to pay attention to is what are the options really for interface between the African continental free trade area. Now we're being, we're implementing it. But we have other free trade areas of the regional economic communities. We've got existing custom unions that I showed earlier, monetary communities. And how are they going to interface? How are they going to relate? Documentation talk about mutually reinforcing, but in practice, what does it really mean? To mutually reinforce. The reality is that regional economic communities had been envisaged by the Abuja Treaty as the building blocks to the African economic community, and they're really established. So institutionally, process-wise, politically, ideologically, if you think about the East African community, for instance, that is vigorously pursuing the political federation of that sub-region. So I end with this slide. I can't really lecture members of parliament about how to oversee implementation. So I was asked to, think about this. It seems to me that, there needs to be updates on the negotiations that are still ongoing. So the various protocols are not resolved, and a number of complex issues are not yet resolved. I was just talking about the rules of origin, the other protocols, trading services. Definitely competition policy will be a big issue. Investment, intellectual property rights, globally, it's always a very big issue, for us here in the continent. So I think for members of parliament, to be updated on these negotiations and how we're resolving these kinds of issues are important. And I do think, anyway, some of this need to be ratified by parliament for implementation. I've made a point about the interface between the continental free trade area and regional communities, monetary unions and monetary communities. I mean, there are many issues, whether given how developed, for lack of a better word, some of the regional economic communities, how are you going to deal with that? So, will you be moving some people to the continental secretariat of the African Free Trade Area? How are you going to, are the regional economic communities going to basically become trade, customs, institutions, mainly administering trade? It's a question, it's a big question, but I don't think so, because also politically, they have a role, they're an institution for the African economic community. I keep raising this point about tripartite FTA, but maybe it's resolved now. So I haven't followed the latest deliberations around this or the negotiations. The big issue about the private sector, for trade, really, if the private sector is not on board, we're not able to do much. And I think this is another critical issue for members of parliament. We need to know that the private sector is on board it plays its part. I mean, you know, big challenge we face globally, I mean, here in Africa, is that the private sector doesn't play its part. So you end up with high levels of unemployment and many other challenges. Here in South Africa, it's a very obvious example of that, a case where the private sector is really not playing its part. It seems to have done it now, COVID, but I mean, some of us are not convinced that the private sector is really playing its role in the society, in the continent. But something that I think you need to negotiate, you need to have conversations with the private sector. There may be reasons why the private sector feels it can invest. I mean, I just can't think of logic to that because it's a market. Private sector makes money anyway, but you could make money and also advance development in your society or in your continent. Are we still adhering to the Abuja Treaty? Some people thought, you need to revisit the Abuja Treaty. We have many debates with people who think so. My view is that we need to stick to it. So you'll miss, targets by a number of years. So if it was envisaged that in 30 years, Africa becomes an African economic community or, graduates into an African economic community, if you miss it by 3 years, if you miss it by 5 years, we have a lifetime. So, and then we know why sometimes we miss targets, there are interference from outside. We do have our own challenges, of course, within the continent, but some of it is because it's really not in the interest of other parts of the world. I can't use this term when I'm talking to members of parliament, but maybe I could. The imperialist outlook is different. So it wouldn't think about Africa. It's good for Africa to advance. It's good for Africa to unite. It's good for Africa to develop. So there's some of the issues, of course, we need to take into account. Our own people, as politicians would say, our people. Our communities, aware of the Continental Free Trade Area. How could it benefit them? How could it benefit the country in the context of South Africa, given that I'm talking to members of parliament in South Africa? And then, of course, parliament needs to monitor, needs to evaluate, do the necessary impact assessment. You could do study tours, proper ones, not going to China and not coming back with any lessons, or Cuba not coming back with any lessons. But study tours can have great value for oversight, for learning, site visits, of course, plenary debates, Q&A sessions. I mean, members of parliament will know this more than myself. So I think I could stop here before I come across as lecturing people who should know better. Thanks, Honorable Member of Parliament.
Thank you, Professor Gumede. Thank you very much. Take this opportunity and invite colleagues for the interaction. Colleagues? You have the function of raising your hand, then we'll pick it up here and recognize you and give you an opportunity. Colleagues?
It was very clear.
It was very clear.
It's been a long day.
It was really
been a long day for all of us.
Yeah, but you were telling us about the proper study tour, not just a study tour, proper study tour.
Yes, they need to be structured better. Yes, I mean you can do so much from better. Study tours. Yeah.
Yes. Colleagues, Honorable Dango, your comment first. Your parting shot, Honorable Dango.
Thank you very, very much, Chairperson. Sorry, I'm losing things all the time, the connections. Chairperson, I think what we should be doing is committing both South Africa to the success of the agreement, that we take all our departments, harmonize it, and move in that particular direction. But Chairperson, we would also have to look at the challenges that we have and find African solutions to find African solutions to African challenges and African problems. Otherwise, we would always be dictated to by other continents and other worlds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Parting shots, Deputy Minister Majola.
Thanks very much, Chairperson. Firstly, let me thank the leadership of the NCOP for organizing the lecture. The inputs made by other panel members have been very insightful and helpful to the work we do. Chairperson, I found it very useful, the input by Professor Gumede. You would know that as an academic, he's freer to speak and be more critical than we do at times. So I think these are the voices we need to ensure that we can correct our weaknesses early in the process. So it may be very useful in future to have a more interactive discussion with professor and others in academia, so that we can deepen our understanding of what is going on, and to also deal with weaknesses that we may confront, so that we can prepare ourselves better. I found the work that he has done, especially at looking at the East African community as a bloc, very useful. I think it would help in that interaction to look at the different blocks in the continent and the progress they are making. Because in the overall, our attitude in South Africa is that the African continental free trade area will succeed if member states in the continent see that it is beneficial to all of them. But if it was to be a situation that it is only certain member states, or what people refer to as big brothers who benefit at the expense of the others, the project will not succeed. So I think that the input by the Prof has been very helpful, including Ambassador Dengo on matters of peacekeeping that we should attend to in the continent, because political and economic integration will not be successful in the conditions of violence that we are seeing erupting around the continent. So, Chairperson, thanks very much for the time, and thanks to the rest of the members and the Deputy Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces and the Chief Whip. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Majola. Thank you. Thanks a million times. Prof, you have touched all the right.
Chair.
Prof, you can see that you have touched all the right buttons, especially about the historical perspective, the issue of integration, the weaknesses when it comes to coordination, the issue of policy coherence, as we have quite correctly outlined it, the issue of the different options when it comes to what we will assist us as a country. And of course, as an academic, it's very important, as we have done it correctly, so to do that constructive weakness in how we do things as members of parliament, because we have a particular role to play. And if we just tick the boxes, not for right reasons, but just for compliance, it's not assisting us as a country. And it was really thought-provoking, and it was very interesting how we were able to rise and raise those issues. And we always enjoy it when we are taken head-on and raising weaknesses, because sometimes it's good to come face-to-face with us and raise sharply issues that are weaknesses in the whole value chain. And at the end of the day, you want to have something that will assist us, because it can be that from 1963 to date, and we're still lamenting the very same problems that were attended better then, and today there's some few steps backwards, and it's us as members of parliament that have to be critical and efficient and effective in playing our role. Let me give you, Prof, for your parting shots. Prof.
Thanks, Member of Parliament, and to other members of Parliament, thanks for the opportunity again. Yeah, indeed, there's so much we can learn within the continent. I think this is a key issue, really. So I've argued, it's controversial to many people, but we really have very little to learn from the experience of, market integration in Europe. So if we pursue that approach to development, we'll be leaving people behind. We'll be leaving livelihoods, well-being, and development that should be taking place. Because market integration, true, it benefits economically, and countries develop. But if you do it the way, I'm just being provocative again, because I do think it's an issue that many people say the reason Africa has been so slow is because it hasn't followed the European approach, the European experience, and I argue actually, we have our own problem. That's why maybe we've been slow, but it's good that we've not followed it, because it wouldn't benefit development. Our preoccupation really has to be well-being. So even economic advancement, in my view, has to be for well-being. How improving livelihood. So and we have a lot to learn within the continent. So when you talk about African solutions, as the ambassador, Honorable Dango said, there's so much. The East African community experience, I found it very interesting. I spent a whole week there, spoke to people who've been involved, and I just think, I'll write something on it perhaps at some point, but I just think there's something to learn from there, but also the mistakes that happen, because mistakes will happen, and how you can deal with that. West African community has got some really useful experience to learn from. I mentioned SACU, which we kind of overlook because of political reasons, ideological reasons. But I think we could understand SACU better, for the common market that we aspire for the monetary union of the African continent as a whole. And of course, yeah, I'm available. We are available for engaging further. It's nicer now to be an academic. So some of you will know that I was in government for a long time. So some of the things you can't really, you're facing different kind of challenges. But once you're outside, you kind of, you spread your wings, so to speak, out of the cage. So some of the things we say, of course, they are very questionable, and so we see this when we debate with policymakers, and then we realize, well, this is just theory because we're not involved. But I think a dialogue can be very helpful for development, for improving the lives of the people. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Prof. I can confirm that we do have the leadership from different provinces that are part of this very important session, members of the National Council of Provinces, and the very same province that we represent, House Chairperson, Ngwenya, Deputy Chairperson, and Eastern Cape, they are here, Northern Cape, they are here, and Limpopo, they are here. Free State, they are here because it's a very important session. Western Cape, they are here, and all our provinces. And let me take this opportunity to thank Deputy Minister Majola for coming in and making your valuable contribution. It was really thought-provoking, and we are convinced that it's going to assist us moving forward as an NCOP. And also thank our Ambassador, Honorable Dango, for his valuable contribution. And of course, the Prof. Gumede, we can see that now we are working in the province where when the sun rises, the people work very hard, and that's Mpumalanga. So it's clear that you have that experience from government and now as an academic, and we have clarified us. We're looking forward. We know in your busy schedule, we decided to avail yourself. We're looking forward even in future to extend the invitation so that we can come together like this and engage. I am aware, colleagues, that it has been a long day. We started with some budget votes, and I'm aware that even if we're concluding here, we still have to have those that will be attending the memorial service of the late Usisi in the house, and they've already started Mufokeng. So without much ado, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for making this day to be a success under the leadership of Mama Lucas and Mama Ngwenya. I officially declare this one closed. Thanks, everybody. Thanks a million times.
Thanks, Papa.
Thank you very much, Papa.
Thank you, Mama.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.